Hello. Today we will be discussing the essay Postmodernism and Performance by Philip Oslander. Philip Oslander is a performance studies researcher at the University of Georgia. This essay, he says, is an attempt to understand the different facets of the phrase postmodernism and performance. Okay, and the biggest problem here lies in the fact that neither postmodernism nor performance can be defined in a singular, unified way. Okay, you already are familiar with the different definitions of postmodernism, given the fact that we are discussing modern European drama and that you have already discussed this term in other papers that you have studied in your previous semesters. Okay, and when you look at the term performance, that is also familiar to you because you already have had an entire paper on body text and performance, right? So, how then, if I ask you today to define these two terms separately, as it may be, you will find it very difficult to do this seemingly easy thing. All right. Now, in this essay, the discussion is focused upon the performance scene in the US. That means the examples that he will be giving us will be primarily based on the performance scene in the US because that is what the researcher or the author is familiar with. Okay. And what he will be tracing is basically the relationship between theater and postmodernism, even though he will bring up a discussion of other forms of performance like the opera, like dance and stand-up comedy even, he will be primarily focusing upon the relationship between theater and modernism. Okay, so as I said earlier, postmodernism and performance are both terms that are very unstable in nature. Okay, and neither of them has a single universal meaning or definition. And that is what makes this entire essay problematic. Because when you try to find the relationship between two terms that have no unified sense of meaning, it becomes, quite hectic, right? So he says, goes on to say that performance is usually connected to events that have an aesthetic appeal. So let's try and understand performance first. What is performance? Okay, you can say that it is an act of presenting a play, a concert, a dance, whatever it may be. It is an act of presenting to an audience with the aim of entertaining, right? So it is usually connected to events that have an aesthetic appeal. That means something that is entertaining or something that, brings people together, makes them want to watch whatever is being put up, is because it has an aesthetic appeal. Okay, and this can include all forms of performances like theater, dance, opera, circus, stand-up comedy, etc. Okay, so what the author is focusing in this particular essay is primarily on theater, as I told you earlier, on dance and on stand-up comedy. And as you will see, if you have read the essay, he has separate subheadings for postmodernism and dance, postmodernism and stand-up comedy, and postmodernism in theater. Okay. So moving on, he says that the concept of postmodernism in relation to performance functions in three different ways. That is one of the most important points that he brings up in this essay. Okay, that the relationship between postmodernism and performance, okay, it functions in three different ways. What are these three different ways? First one is that it acts as a periodizing concept. Second one is that it acts as a way of describing the contemporary culture in which the performance occurs. And the third is as a stylistic descriptor. Now I'll explain each of these functions in detail. The first function that the author tells us about is the use of postmodernism and performance as a as a periodizing concept. Okay, and as when you see the word periodic, you understand that it has something to do with chronology, it has something to do with history. So what happens here is that he is using the term postmodern to describe a particular moment in history. That is, when we study the literary movements in history of literature, we have specialized periods that, this is when modernism came and this is when postmodernism came. All right, so as postmodernism as a particular moment in history is what this is. But this is problematic because you will see that even though you might think that, postmodernism is a phenomena that came after the Second World War, if you try and match the dates, there might be works that, as we discussed in the previous essay, there are works which shows elements of postmodernism and modernism even before they became actual movements in literary history. Okay, so the first one is as a periodizing concept in the sense that postmodernism is used to describe a particular moment in history. Okay. The second use is that some definitions are almost synonymous with the uses of the term to describe contemporary culture. Okay, usually when we say postmodern, everyone uses it usually in a very common connotation. Postmodernism stands for the contemporary culture. Okay, so what happens here is that when you define postmodern era by addressing questions like when it began and how it differs from earlier movements. So when you try to define postmodernism, you will define it by saying that it began in the 1960s or the 1970s or after the Second World War, whatever is the date that you choose. Then you will say that how does it differ from modernism? Every discussion of postmodernism has brought into light, the differences that it has to modernism. Okay, so that is what the author is saying here. All right. On the other hand, there are others who do not wish to delineate a historical boundary or time period for modernism. Okay, so there are two ways in which this happens. All right. What is the second way? First way, you will put it within a period of history. That is what we said, as a historical moment in history. But there are others who do not want to put, who do not want to describe or define rather postmodernism as something that happened in a particular moment in time. Okay, they say that it is something that has been gradually growing. Okay, so there is no particular moment in time or a moment in history to which we can pinpoint and say that yes, this is when postmodernism began. So they don't want to put a historical boundary or a time period for postmodernism. Okay, so the first one was that it is used as a moment in history. Second one is that it is used to define the contemporary culture, okay, in which the performance occurs. So whichever contemporary performance is being put up, then it has been analyzed and seen and checked for postmodernist elements, and then it is said that yes, it is postmodern work. So even though a production that may be released in the year 2021, if it has elements that are gothic or rather romantic, you cannot call it as a postmodern work. So here they're using postmodernism not based on a historical moment, but based on what it signifies. Okay, the third usage is used as a stylistic term, okay, which means it is used to identify new developments in the aesthetic genres within well-established conventions. Okay, so that what does it mean? It means as a stylistically, what are the stylistic developments or the stylistic changes that have come across through the different literary ages that we have, or what are the new developments that you see, new additions that you see in the kind of literature or the kind of performance that is put up today. So these stylistic elements are analyzed, and how these stylistic elements are changing the well-established genres are looked into. All right. Now, the problem here is that all three of these intersect. When I have been explaining them to you, you can see how all three of them were intersecting with each other. Right. So that is again problematic. Okay, because how performances relate to postmodernism, both in a cultural as well as in a historical sense. So when you talk about postmodernism and performance, you cannot put it only in a historical sense, or you cannot put it only in a contemporary sense. Okay, but you have to look at the different ways in which these two relate to each other, these two terms. So every performance that is brought up, that is existing in the contemporary era, if we choose to define it in that manner, okay, that is existing in the contemporary era, will become postmodern only if it has stylistic elements of postmodernism. Okay, so rather than delineating a historical period, there are many different ways in which postmodernism and performances are coming together, and that is why it is very difficult to define both these terms. All right. One important difference between the historical and the cultural connotations of postmodernism is evident through the use of adjectives. I think you must have already seen this phenomena of using adjectives, especially when we talk about the term post-colonialism. Okay, do you put a hyphen in between, or do you use it as a single term? Similarly here, in a little bit slightly different manner, the use of the adjective postmodern and postmodernist. Okay, Postmodern is a particular historical period. Okay, so when you're talking about postmodernism and performance, you have to focus on what term is being used there. If it is being called a postmodern performance, it would be relating to a particular historical period, probably after the Second World War, 1970s onwards. Okay, so when we talk about a postmodern work, it will be based on the historical period, based on the time period in which this production was, or this performance was produced. Okay, the second usage or the second adjective is postmodernist. Okay, postmodernist. Now, postmodernist um, are basically cultural works that possess stylistic features that make them postmodern in feeling rather than associating it with a time period. So when you talk about postmodernist, it's not only about the time period or the historical age in which this work was produced, but rather the stylistic elements that it has that makes you feel that this work is rather postmodernist. Okay, or it's rather postmodernist is what you feel, that feel that you get from the elements that are used. Okay, rather than because of its historical element, is called postmodernist. So there are two adjectives that are there, and these are the major, this is the major difference that you can find in the use of this term. So when you call something as a postmodern performance, it would be something in a historical sense. Rather, when you use it as a postmodernist performance, it will be based on, yes, it will be based on the stylistic or the cultural elements that it seeks to convey. Hence, following the same argument, we can say that some performances that are postmodern in the historical sense, that means when you look at the time period, it will be in the postmodern period. All right, but these same works will not be stylistically postmodernist. All right, so that is how you can differentiate, is what the author tells us. Although within aesthetic realms, there